I'm going to start with an issue that's currently making its way through dozens of state legislatures across our country, and that is the issue of transgender females participating in sports. Just last week, we had Florida Governor Ron DeSantis signing a bill banning trans female athletes from playing girls and women's sports. Proponents, including trans Caitlyn Jenner, says this was the right decision because they said that having females compete against biological males does not level the playing field. Raquel, I'm going to start with you. Some are suggesting, in the pursuit of fairness, that we should consider having a transgender sports league. Do they have a point?
Well, I think that we have to back up and understand that there isn't actually this major problem of inclusion of trans people in this way that a lot of people on the conservative side are trying to make it out to be a problem. We need to be making spaces where everyone can fully be seen as themselves and be respected in their agency and bodily autonomy. And we can't have these assumptions about people's bodies. We've got to let people play the sports, and especially our youth.
Chase, this summer could be a big one for transgenders in sports. We could see the first openly transgender athlete compete in the Tokyo Olympic Games. Laurel Hubbard of Australia is expected to qualify for weightlifting, and her opponent, or a potential opponent, is saying that that's not fair, saying that Hubbard physically developing as a man before her transition gives her an inherent unfair advantage over her competition. She likened it to athletes on steroids. Is it fair?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely fair to have trans women and girls competing in every level of sport, which we have had for decades. So, for example, at the Olympic level, which is the very elitist, the most elite level of sporting competition, trans women and girls have been eligible to compete for decades. Laurel will be the first trans woman to ever qualify. Her current statistics do not even put her in medal contention. So the idea of trans dominance is completely overblown. It's a myth. Trans women have not even qualified for the Olympics up until this point. But I think stepping back, we're now having a conversation about high school, middle school, elementary school athletics in the United States importing even more stringent inclusion policies than we see on the Olympic stage. It is harder for a fourth grade transgender girl in 10 states in the United States to compete in sports than it is for an Olympian. And that's what we're looking at in the United States. Bills that are targeting trans people for discrimination at very young ages, not only bills targeting trans people in sports, but other pieces of legislation that would bar trans people from the restroom, prohibit trans people from using pronouns that they use, and take away healthcare for transgender young people. So this is a sweeping set of attacks, and that at the most elite level in the Olympics, we have had no example of trans dominance, nor have we had any example in the last 4 decades of inclusion across the United States.
Chase, since the Supreme Court ruling protecting workers from discrimination last year, what improvements have you seen in offices across America?
Well, when we look at the impact of the Supreme Court's decision, what the court essentially said was affirming the lower courts, which have held for many years that LGBTQ people are protected from discrimination under federal civil rights statutes. And this has been true for a long time. The source of the protection are the federal civil rights statutes themselves. I think what we hope to see in the coming years, now that the Bostock decision will be implemented, hopefully more robustly by this administration, is that we are going to experience more enforced and expansive protections across federal civil rights statutes. But unfortunately, we are continuing to see, despite that landmark decision, despite the clear protections under federal civil rights statutes and the United States Constitution, these efforts to attack trans young people through state legislatures and these bills that clearly violate Title IX when it comes to the bills that target students in schools, and the Constitution when it comes to all of them.
Raquel, I want to go back to corporate America for a moment, sort of what we talk about here at Yahoo Finance. And right now you've got more than 65 companies, big name companies, coming out against anti-transgender legislation making its way through lots of different states right now. And these are companies we all know well: Facebook, Amazon, Uber, Pfizer, American Airlines, Nike, the list goes on. Are they doing enough? Is it just lip service? What more would you like to see corporate America do to elevate and support the transgender community?
Well, I definitely think it's important for these corporations and leaders and, of course, lawmakers to make a stand against anti-trans legislation. That is one of the first things that people and organizations can do. But I think one of the important things that we need to see is structural changes also within these companies that profess to support trans people. Are you actually hiring trans people? Are you actually creating environments where trans people can be our full selves and not kind of face these textbook experiences of discrimination? And I think the other thing as well is we have to continue to find ways to move resources to transgender community leaders and organizations that are often on the front lines of these fights. I think that is not often happening enough, especially during Pride Month when we see many Pride campaigns that only support these kind of larger national organizations that often don't have trans people in leadership or may not even have any on their staff, period. We need to see more resources going to trans leaders in our organizations.
And Raquel, quickly, I wanted to ask you about America's treatment of Black trans women. It's been described as a pandemic within a pandemic. What kind of solutions at both the local and federal level would help address the inequities Black trans women face?
Well, of course, every Black trans woman is different. And when you're experiencing violence, it's different based on location. So I think people need to be working with community leaders who are often, again, on the front lines of figuring out these solutions. I think that the Biden-Harris administration needs to make true on their promise to move more resources to these community organizations. That was a campaign trail promise that I discussed in a Time op-ed recently. And I also think that we need to consider violence holistically. So Black trans women, of course, are facing violence within our communities, but state violence is also a thing that plagues Black trans people in general and trans people in general. We're not talking enough about domestic violence and our place in the Violence Against Women Act. So there's a lot of work that needs to happen, and we need to consider trans people and Black trans women in our totality.
Welcome back to A Time for Change. LGBTQ teens and young adults have always been at a greater risk for suicide than their heterosexual peers. I want to take a look at some numbers that we showed you at the top of the show. In the past year, 42% of LGBTQ plus young people seriously considered suicide, and half of transgender youth did.
And that study is from an organization called the Trevor Project, which has offered support and resources to LGBTQ teens and young adults for more than 20 years. I spoke with Amit, Paley, CEO of the Trevor Project, about what some companies are doing to support the community and the impact of the economic shutdown and stay-at-home orders on LGBTQ youth.
The pandemic has had a very dramatic impact on LGBTQ young people. It has impacted them in so many ways. There are young people who are more at the K-12 level who normally would have sources of support in their schools in person from teachers or guidance counselors or GSAs who now are cut off from that and have been trapped in homes with parents or families that are unsupportive, in some cases emotionally abusive or even physically abusive. And same at the university level and college level, a lot of students cut out for the first time in college. And then when the pandemic happened and they had to go home, they had to quickly make a decision if they were going to come back and come out to their parents or go back into the closet. In both cases, very challenging decisions. So we hear those types of stories every day at the Trevor Project, and our call volume has at times been more than double our typical volume. So it's a huge impact on the mental health of LGBTQ youth.
And what has been the most harmful aspect of the pandemic aside from the virus itself? Is it the economic shutdown with all non-essential businesses closed, or the stay-at-home orders?
I think it's all of it. And for different LGBTQ youth, there are different things that matter most to them and that have impacted them most. For this, the stay-at-home orders have been very difficult because, as I just mentioned, there have been so many young people who, if they don't have supportive families or parents, they would find that support in other physical settings. And so being trapped in homes with parents or families that are unsupportive could really have a huge impact. We saw in our national survey on LGBTQ youth mental health that 80% said COVID-19 made their living situation more stressful. and only 1 in 3 found their home to be LGBTQ affirming. And I think it's also important to note that this is not new. They're not new things that happen just because of the pandemic. LGBTQ youth are at greater risk of suicide and discrimination even before this pandemic. This pandemic really exacerbated a lot of the pre-existing forms of discrimination and isolation that existed.
And Amit, you alluded to it, recent research that your organization released that shows that affirming spaces and support systems help save LGBTQ lives. Many have turned to online communities for support, yet an overwhelming majority say that when it comes to social media, they're both positive and negative impacts. So what is your advice to LGBTQ youth when it comes to social media and online communities?
Well, it really is going to depend on the type of situation that LGBTQ young people are in. As you mentioned, social media is both very helpful and it can be very harmful. For LGBTQ young people who might be in parts of the country or in living situations where they just do not have the ability to connect with people who are like them, social media can be life-saving. It allows them to have a sense of community. It allows them to connect with people who are like them. It allows them to feel less alone. And we also know that social media can be filled with trolls, can be filled with people who are hateful, and those messages of hate can be very difficult. And so I think it's important for LGBTQ young people to try to find spaces that are safe and healthy for them, and to be aware that there is going to be hate that exists in the world, and that can be challenging to face, and to also be aware that there are many, many people in the world who not only are not hateful, but are going to celebrate and support LGBTQ for being who they are.
Well, Google is listed as being one of your top corporate partners. They've contributed more than $1 million to the Trevor Project. How have you used those funds? And has Google also been a partner when it comes to addressing the negative impact of social media on LGBTQ youth?
Google has been an incredible partner to the Trevor Project in helping us to leverage technology to serve more LGBTQ young people. It's not easy to be able to provide high quality service to young people who are counting on it. And so a lot of the work we've been doing with Google has been, how can we leverage best practices in technology in the need that LGBTQ youth have, and to help them get the best quality care that they have. And Google has been working to ensure that they are providing resources to their own employees and more support and messages of support to LGBTQ youth. Obviously, all parts of this country have a long journey to go on. And I think what's important is to make sure that we are encouraging companies to do more to support and be there for LGBTQ youth who are in need.
Other corporate sponsors for the Trevor Project include AT&T, FedEx, Coca-Cola, Bank of America. What do you think these companies get out of partnering with the Trevor Project? And are they simply motivated by goodwill, or is this having an impact on their bottom line?
Well, I think it depends on the type of company that there is. I think some companies are really looking for the opportunity to make a difference. And I think we are seeing more and more companies that are realizing that they have an obligation to shareholders, and they also have an obligation to society, and they need to be investing in important stakeholders in society and making the world a better place. So I think we're gratified to see more companies doing that. And the more that companies can show that they care about LGBTQ young people and about other social issues, that's going to be important for their employees. That's going to be important for customers. And I think we are seeing that more people are looking at companies and saying, is this company taking steps to make the world a better place? And that is part of the calculus that consumers are making in deciding where to put their dollars.
And Amit, what else would you like to see corporate America do to really support LGBTQ youth in America?
There are a number of things that we hope corporate America will do. I think right now, when we look at the political space in this country, we are seeing consistent attacks on LGBTQ young people, and in particular, transgender and non-binary young people. This is happening at the state level in state capitals across the country, and companies can and should be speaking out. They should be saying it is wrong to discriminate on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity, and advocating for legislatures to take the right steps. And on the federal level, there are a number of things they can do. The Equality Act is a very important piece of legislation. They can make clear to senators in particular and members of Congress that it is consistent with their corporate values to have a country that is eliminating discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity. They also can be investing in nonprofits like the Trevor Project. They can be putting out positive messaging, which is normalizing the importance of recognizing LGBTQ youth. And they can also be taking steps for their internal employees. Many employees are young people themselves. And so doing things like recognizing the importance of pronouns, having trans-inclusive healthcare policies, all gender restrooms, those are just some of the things they can do to make the world a better place for LGBTQ people and young people.
And that was Trevor Project CEO Amit Paley talking about what corporate America can do more of to support the LGBTQ community.
You know, Sabeel, I think it's a striking number that we brought up earlier in the show, and I'm wondering if Amit had anything to say about that high number of transgenders who have seriously considered suicide. It's something like 50%.
Yes, that number is very high. And what Amit Paley was saying is that they have trained counselors at the Trevor Project who really deal with those calls and try to provide support to LGBTQ youth as they were dealing with all the impacts of the pandemic. So that's why we saw that spike in suicide calls. But Alexis, I'm curious to know, what was your reaction to Amit's interview?
Oh, I think that it's very powerful. You know, I think that, this show is an important one, what we're saying here today, to shine a light on transgender. It's part of Title VII, as we saw with the Supreme Court case last year. They won important rights in 2020. But as we're hearing today during the show and what Amit just laid out for us, there's still a lot of ground to be made up.
Absolutely. And still ahead, the president and CEO of GLAAD weighs in on the changing role of companies in the fight for LGBTQ equality. It's Pride Month, but how much meaningful change goes along with all of those rainbow logos and merchandise? For an upcoming special, our colleagues at Yahoo spoke with some of the biggest names in the LGBTQ community about the evolution of Pride, including Sarah Kate Ellis, president and CEO of GLAAD, who had this to say about what's needed from corporate America.
You need to be a company that is open to all these days, because we see it in the research that's coming up. 1 in 6 18 to 24-year-olds identify as LGBT. And so if you're thinking about attracting the next consumer set or attracting your next employee base, you need to offer an open and welcoming environment. And that includes both internally getting your policies, your HR policies in order, setting the right culture that is accepting and open to all, and then externally supporting the LGBTQ community.
And Alexis, their transparency really being key here.
For sure. That was Sarah Kate Ellis, CEO of GLAAD. That's going to do it for Time for Change this week. I'm Alexis Christoforous, along with Sabeel Marsalis. Thanks so much